Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Property Investor Podcast. I've got a fabulous guest with me today, Adam Lawrence. Happy New Year. Welcome to the podcast again.
Thanks for having me again, Paul, and Happy New Year to you and to everybody listening.
Yeah, exciting times. And this is turning into a highly anticipated annual treat for me, I have to say. And I mentioned it to a few people in preparation for this, and everybody was very excited. So you've got a lot of people who are very interested to see what you have to say.
That's great
Um,
to hear.
I'd like to kind of position the podcast. So, what we are at this time of year, and I would say probably perennially now, just bombarded with so much information, and I think it's becoming almost impossible to see the wood for the trees. For those that enjoy skiing, it feels like skiing in whiteout. There is so much information, there's so much going on that the slope becomes you can't really see the slope, and that's not a great environment to be in. Let's be honest. So to kick off the year, I wanted to come to you, Adam, and I'll get I think it's called giving people flowers nowadays. I think that's the new term for it, which is I'm coming to you, Adam, full disclosure, because you're the voice in property that I trust. You're unbiased, um, and you're not coming within an agenda, but you've got that grasp and the detail that I don't think many have. So yeah, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Appreciate the kind words, Paul. Thank you.
So big picture for 2026. This is the theme. I want to get your macro insights for the year ahead, talk about challenges, shifting landscape, and then finish with opportunities. But before we get to that, I think it's always good to start with, what did we learn? What did we learn from last year? So, Adam, what were we as investors meant to have learned from last year?
Yeah, it's a great place to start, Paul. I think I got quite bullish at one stage when the Labour Party had sort of lent on the FCA and the PRA to loosen the mortgage lending requirements and have a look at the stress tests and things like that. Ultimately, I see the market in a fairly straightforward way in that the bulk of the transactions, about 90% of the transactions that went on last year, are driven by residential buyers. First time buyers were pretty active. They had a pretty good year. And that's normally a fairly healthy sign of the grassroots part of the market. I believe the market in the UK works from the ground up. So it doesn't really matter too much what's going on at the £2 million level because there's a mansion tax announced or whatever. That
Mhm.
kind of moves on its own and it's a very, very small slice of the market. So it looked like at one stage I thought prices might start moving a little bit more. I think I probably underestimated how much of a jam that extra bit of stamp duty would be when the stamp duty holiday, as it was, expired on the 1st of April. Rachel Reeves has let a lot of holidays and discounts and things expire,
Mhm.
which I guess you've got to do at some stage because that's all already been priced in and it hasn't been fantastic in terms of the tax landscape and everything else, as everybody will know. So that didn't really wash out. We've only got the nationwide figures at the moment as we're recording this, Paul, but they've said 0.6% up for last year, which hides a fair bit, I think, really, because there's lots and lots of ways, and we will, I'm sure, during this podcast, sort of slice the market in different ways. But if you went expensive to cheap,
Mhm.
which is a bit of a proxy for south to north, but not necessarily, not in its entirety. The expensive stuff's done poorly.
Mhm.
London has dropped in value by almost any metric last year, not on the nationwide figures, interestingly enough, actually. But I think on the ONS figures, you will see that London has dropped in value on what's actually transacted. And of course, the transactions have also gone down in number, which is what usually happens because most people can afford to put a move off by 2 or 3 years if they're not a first time buyer.
Mhm.
Generally speaking, those who are moving around for work, it's slightly different. But the penalty for doing that these days looks a bit different, and maybe we'll talk about that later on. But I think we saw a market that didn't really therefore get going, but it did do plenty of transactions. It
Mhm.
looked healthy. The mortgage offers were very, very steady month to month on the Bank of England figures. Confidence has definitely returned. We've shaken off the doldrums of a 2023. We've largely shaken off at least sort of 80% of the old loans that were at the old super cheap money.
Hmm.
All of this it's all headwinds, Paul. I
Hmm.
think if those brakes were taken off, we'd be seeing a really healthy market, I think,
Hmm.
at the moment. And of course, we haven't got a stamp duty, well, not to our knowledge anyway, but we haven't got a stamp duty hike this year. So we obviously were also dealing with the 3% going to 5% at the end of 2024, which was a surprise to most people. So that affected the investor side, affects how many transactions the investor market will do. But I think we've got a pretty positive setup at the moment, and there is chat, of course, for 2026 of the FCA, the PRA looking at the underwriting criteria for self-employed individuals to try and bring that a bit more into line with something reasonable. So I don't want everyone to get excited. I don't think it's going to be the return of self-cert or anything like that. But still, it will be a little bit more lubrication in the market. And I personally believe this iteration of the Labour Party, if this is the one that will see us out to the 2029 election, whatever happens there, have got in their minds to just bring the housing market forward around about election year. And whilst that's not an exact science, I think they put the bad stuff up front, largely speaking.
Hmm.
Will we see a return to Help to Buy, for example? Again, maybe we might talk about that later on, possibly. But we didn't see it last year when I had a couple of messages from industry insiders who were like, just to let you know, it's coming back. We've been told it's coming back. And then it didn't happen. But it's probably a not yet rather than a no, because they know that the industry, that the new build industry, it needs some help with the whole viability problem that there is in that industry at the moment.
How interesting. I mean, you're very good, I think, at walking that delicate balance of commenting on things that have a political nature, but not necessarily, positioning and advocating continually for one side, which you do see people do, and then in a way it kind of diminishes that voice because you kind of know which direction they're always going to get going. But it's fascinating. You piqued my interest. So you don't think Sir Keir Starmer is going to be potentially around in 2028 when they position for the election?
So, I mean, look, if you look at the betting markets, if you look at Polymarket, which is kind of the
Yeah, yeah.
Bible on this stuff these days, they say 50-50 he's gone by the end of the year. I think the 50% that says he's going to stay is because it's hard to get rid of a Labour Party leader. And the insiders at the Labour Party say that he will dig his heels in and he'll stay where he is. How bad will the election results be in May, Paul? That's the question. I mean, I think if Reform thought they were going to take Wales, they probably won't now, is what you would read into. You're probably reading a lot into one by-election result there, but the overall polling, I mean, it'll still be bad for Labour because Plaid Cymru are going to take them apart, I think. But what will happen in Scotland, more difficult to predict, but it doesn't feel like. I mean, some of these approval ratings that are out are just insanely bad, aren't they?
Yeah.
16% approve and things like that. I mean, it was never that popular in the first place, but he could be hard-headed and stubborn, and if he believes, and I think he does believe, Paul, in his heart, that he's doing the right thing.
Yeah.
He's the right person to be doing the right
Great.
thing. And he probably think, look, he knew it was going to be tough. No one ever said it would be easy. It's the prime minister at the end of the day, and I think Rachel Reeves probably roughly feels the same on that front as well. And in reality, I do think Rachel Reeves has the support of the international bond markets and the city in general, because quite quietly, she's deregulated some bits in the city. She's moved the cap off. Bankers' bonuses have got no cap anymore. This is all
Mhm.
quietly sort of, just cracking on in the background,
Yeah.
regardless of what happened the last time we had a Labour government in power when we had a difficult financial time, obviously, in the financial services sector. So I don't know. I don't know. I'm definitely not on the bus of he's definitely going this year.
Mhm.
Definitely not. So let's see. Let's see. But he has now said, publicly on at the beginning of 2026 on the social media, this is the year where it's going to start to feel better. And I think he's probably wrong about that, Paul, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
just because of the taxes that are still seeping in. Because a lot of these tax tweaks that have been made, maybe one of the points that might have been missed after last year's budget, they're all staggered to be this year, next year, 2028, 2029. Extremely unlikely to do a tax change in an election year, but we'll see. But they found a way to upset almost everybody in their own little way by doing all these little tweaks that they've kind of backed themselves into this corner of doing.
Mhm.
But, when you're unpopular, I mean, Margaret Thatcher was extremely unpopular at the beginning of her premiership, and look what happened there. I'm not suggesting Starmer's going to do 11 years or whatever before anybody worries too much about that. But yeah, there's definitely water to flow under this bridge yet. There's a lot of things yet to happen.
That's interesting. And I mean, it is, I think, widely recognized that, when you've got a big majority and you've just come into power, you have got that 1 year to really kind of do the not to do the damage, but you've got to. That's if you're going to assert your authority, that is when to do it. And we're seeing it across the pond as well. We're seeing it here. It's interesting, like I don't want to spend too long on this, but for me, it seemed to have got off on the wrong foot. When he appeared in the garden of Downing Street and said, it's going to get worse before it gets better, which wasn't really, I don't think, the sentiment that we perhaps needed. And sentiment, I think, is an important part of the picture. And sentiment has been pretty poor, pretty consistently, which doesn't help, for example, property or small business, because sentiment. You want there to be those animal spirits, as sometimes it's referred to, of people wanting to invest, take risks, but we don't seem to have that.
No, I completely agree with you. And I think probably the want to be very different. One thing you could level at Boris Johnson's feet is that he was always positive. Too
Yeah,
positive,
yeah.
probably, but he was. But there is a concept in economics known as boosterism,
Mhm,
whereby people do, confidence is a self-perpetuating prophecy, Paul,
mhm,
ultimately. And you need people to be confident. If they're not confident from an economic perspective, they keep their money in their pockets. They're nervous. They say, we were already nervous after a pandemic. It takes time for the national psyche to heal on the back of all of that. But Starmer gave us no reasons to spend money and every reason to save money. And
mhm,
saving, although, people never come out and say this, is really quite incredibly damaging for the economy. Of course, we need a level of savings, but
mhm,
if people aren't consuming, like you say, how are those small grassroots businesses? If people aren't transacting with them, they're struggling. They've got the backdrop has all been and the chatter has all been about the costs ramping up. And it is true, business rates, minimum wage, all the rest of that, absolutely true. But on the flip side, if your costs are increasing, you can get over that if you increase revenue.
mhm,
Now, prices have gone up so much over the past 5.5 odd years that, increasing prices alone is not going to do it. So you've got to drive volume. You've got to drive volume somehow. But if people have got their hands firmly jammed in their pockets, where's that revenue going to come from?
Definitely. And I mean, as I said, I don't want to spend too long on this, but you think about the fiscal drag that we're seeing. An answer is actually to raise the threshold of the lowest rate of income tax, just unleash or release that spending power into the marketplace. Because the truth is, all of that will go on consumption. None of that's going to be invested in financial assets and all the things that maybe people are less keen on. But all of that is consumption. It'll be spent in local businesses. It'll be it all goes on consumption, doesn't it? As well as housing costs, for example, as well.
Well, one of the things you could kill two birds with one stone here in theory, couldn't you?
Yeah.
Because if you did put the personal allowance up to 20 grand, but then
Mhm.
you said, right, you're going to start to lose your personal allowance from 50 grand, right? But we're going to taper that on a lot longer tail. So we're going to taper it between, say, 50 and 150. You wouldn't have this horrible 60% tax rate cliff that we get at the 100 grand level. It would be
Mhm.
a lot more spread out. You'd be spreading the pain amongst many more of the people. And everybody who benefited, the people on 50 grand or just over 50 grand, will benefit from the increase in the personal allowance as well. So you could really sort out a few things with a bit of a tax tweak that to me doesn't seem that hard. But I'm a big believer in people respond to incentives. And at the moment, I hear too many anecdotal stories about people not wanting to push through the 100K. You know, the more productive workers in the economy by economic measures of productivity are
Mhm.
disincentivized by, as soon as you start losing over half of your income in tax, of course it's going to be a
Mhm.
disincentive. I think people are quite simplistic like that. They think no one likes paying 40%, 45%, whatever, but you're still keeping the lion's share. If you're paying 60, you just think, oh,
Mhm.
blimey, if I've had a new promotion in order to achieve that, what am I actually taking home? You
Mhm.
know?
And then you can do that horrible thing of working out at what point in the year are you working for yourself as opposed to
Yeah.
for the government.
Yeah.
But it's best never to do that as a calculation, I
No,
think.
agreed.
Um,
Agreed.
so um, look, I'm very interested in North-South divide and also kind of cheapest to most expensive. And I think there's two interesting things there is, anecdotally talking to my friends who invest in London, they've had a terrible time of it. Genuinely
Mm.
terrible
Yeah.
terrible time of it. I
Yeah.
appreciate people won't get the violins out, but you're talking about people who, they work hard for a living and they've deferred gratification and they've put
Yeah.
every penny they can save into real estate because they think that's a wise choice. And they unbelievably have seen their equity going down year on year for a period of time. And, that was not in the brochure. They had no anticipation of that. And it's
Mm.
obviously very uncomfortable. And, it needs to be addressed. So when we look at, I like looking at a good chart from time to time, the house price index charts, and you say, oh, right, so we kind of peaked out 2022 roughly, and then we've had this almost consolidation, sideways movement to where we are today. But that doesn't tell the story because the South has been struggling, central London real estate, prime real estate has been struggling, but yet the North, and I would include the Midlands in that as well, Midlands and Manchester, and certainly Leeds, pretty buoyant actually,
Yeah.
pretty buoyant. So what's your perspective on that?
Well, I think you've got a few things that have a sort of confluence of factors really that have meant that's happening. We're still seeing a net move from jobs from London, from the southeast up towards the Leeds and the Manchesters and the Birminghams of the world on a net basis in general. Aside
Mhm.
from anything else, people look and the salaries are so much cheaper. You speak to people who've got an office in London, an office in Birmingham, and blah blah, and the office in London is for show, generally speaking, of an SME, and the
Yeah.
office in Birmingham does the work because the people are half the cost. That's the reality of it. So that's a sensible bit of geographical arbitrage that's been going on. We don't hear the words levelling up anymore. I don't remember them officially getting phased out, but some of those policies obviously still take longer to kick in. So you've got commercial reasons and political reasons to an extent. So that's definitely been a factor. But the fact that, if you think about what's happened to wages in general over the past few years, ultimately at the lower end, with the compression from the minimum wage pushing things upwards and all the rest of it, we're now at a place where minimum wage, two people in a household, they earn 50 grand.
Hmm.
Even on a 4.5 times multiplier, they can borrow 225. If they've got a deposit, it's definitely an entry level home in outer Manchester,
Hmm.
a decent one in outer Birmingham, no doubt about it, for a first time buyer effort. Same would go for Leeds. And of course, those city centres still attract a bit more of a premium than a minimum wage. So they're actually not doing too badly. Affordability is back. Like you said, Paul, if we generalise and said prices have been pretty flat since 2022, inflation's obviously done a lot of legwork there as well when it comes to affordability. And wage inflation has been above inflation. The only problems come with that fiscal drag that I always worry in these circumstances because we don't have a 10-year period of evidence of what freezing all the thresholds will do because
Hmm.
we've never had to do it before. It's tax rises without saying that there are tax rises. It's just a nasty way of doing it. And if you look last year, you had real household disposable income down 1.7%. We've only got figures for the first 3 quarters at the moment, but that was despite how can that be when wages have gone up above inflation? Well, fairly simply, because the government's been taking more out of the pie, thanks to the fiscal drag and the new taxes that have been introduced in general. So households are worse off last year, despite utilities coming back under control. And to be fair to the Labour Party, you can see why they've targeted the trains because they've got a bit more influence on that these days. And freezing train tickets, I think that probably means something to you if you're a season ticket holder. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything to you, probably. But obviously, utility bills does mean something to everybody as well. So direct intervention in trying to control inflation, I've actually found quite interesting. They haven't really got the political capital out of it that I think they should have done, but I think that's probably because they're just not very good communicators. But
Hmm.
in the more affordable side of the market, things are, in spite of, like you said, not being given great confidence by the PM or the Chancellor, people have worked out for themselves. They still want to own houses, they still want to buy property, they still want to get on the ladder. They delayed things around the time of Liz Truss because things were all over the place with mortgage rates and you've got to see where you're at and all the rest of it. But like I said, the Bank of England figures are showing all alive and well on that front. So the sub 250, sub 300k market, doing fine. The sub 300k market is still stamp free for first time buyers, ultimately.
And that is a very interesting point. This I'm going to call it liquidity curve. We might find a better piece of terminology for it. But if we could visualize in our minds, you know, prices, starting at say 50 to 2 million and what the curve would look like in terms of the availability of liquidity, it seems to me that, and echoing what you've just said, that, at the well, I'll ask your view on this, but I'm going to make it up and say at the sort of 150k price point, there is then a rush in of liquidity because that's the areas people want to live in. Maybe this lower price points, there's not quite as much liquidity, there's not as many buyers in that space. And then if you're thinking regionally, like 400 has got good availability, but after 500 things start to curve off because then you're really into the higher incomes. Part of the reason for asking the question is what has been interesting anecdotally for me is a friend in the north of England was selling a house for 1.5 million. And it was a revelation to me how difficult that is. You know, it's fascinating because we, blindly assume that there's lots of buyers in that marketplace, but actually there are a handful of buyers for your house. You might have, and this was the most beautiful house you've ever seen in the most perfect location, couldn't be better, absolutely breathtaking. But yet there's only a handful of buyers. And then I'll come to you on that, but I suppose just to signal where we could go after that is then, well, what does that mean for the shift in demographics? Because if the baby boomers have, seen and I don't say this with like any tone to it, but if they've seen 40 to 50x increases in value and they are in these very expensive properties, as over the next decade, what does it mean for those properties as the baby boomers move on? Because there'll be selling pressure, but how many buyers are there going to be? So if we pull it back to the beginning, talk to us about, where is liquidity in the property market now?
Yeah, I think there's a lot there and a lot of really good stuff there. And I think what you're saying, I wouldn't disagree much with your 150 to sort of 400 bracket on outside, certainly outside of London anyway.
Yeah.
And obviously the London market would look somewhat different, and some markets in the southeast would look somewhat different. I think that your example of your friend's property is one of the old don't have the best house in the road because it's always more difficult to do stuff at the top level.
Mm,
And prime, whilst it always wins out in a market like this, where look, this government have openly said they're targeting the top 10% to subsidise the bottom 10%. There was a graph they published after the 2024 budget very proudly saying, look, they're redistributive. And that's what you would expect. They are the Labour Party, right?
yeah.
So but if you that's going to hurt the confidence of the top 10% who are going to be the people in the shaker to buy your friend's property more than
Mhm.
anything. So you hunker down, you take cover. You stop maybe consuming as much as you were. I know that we have as a household, as a general rule,
Hmm.
because what's coming next, we don't know. We've had huge cost increases. Like you said, there won't be any violins, but we've got children at private school. There's a cost increase people hadn't necessarily prepared themselves for or thought was coming as quickly as it did. But it did, and you got to suck it up and get on with it. And unlike what most people think, 90% of the parents at the school are in the same boat. And yeah, 10% are brush it off like it's nothing, sure thing. But that's not the reality of the people who pay for their children's education through the direct route, let's say.
Hmm.
So I think your 150 to 400 is pretty good. I could probably argue 25 grand here and there, sort of thing. But I think that's pretty good in terms of. And then, of course, there is investment liquidity. And these days, there are investment products which mortgages start at 20, 25 grand. So there are still, even at the 50 grand level, there is investor liquidity as a general rule. And people get seduced by yield, and there's people coming into the market and people leaving and all the rest of it. And of course, there's more and more leaseback style stuff, housing provider, short let, all sorts of temporary accommodation, lots and lots of different methodologies these days that are tending to work okay in some of these properties. I know people in Middlesbrough, for example, who are operating that in properties that are maybe 80, 90 grand. You don't need mega returns to get a very nice yield out of one of those. I mean, there are still open market transactions taking place, but it's more of a 50-50, 60-40 investor led. And when you think about that in the context of the North South thing, investment money has had a choice in London, really, hasn't it? It either stops buying altogether
Hmm.
or it migrates out, possibly into Kent and Essex, into various bits and pockets where there is more yield or a workable yield, just about. Or it moves right all the way up the country or over to Wales. And I think we've definitely seen that's part of the thing that's driven some of the market in the cheaper areas of the north, where people are hunting yield because they need to hunt yield. And if you have a year like 2025 where the headlines say 0.6% growth, if the message that gets through is, oh, there's no capital growth anymore, then people will be even more hungry for yield because you're always looking at total returns ultimately. I mean, like you said, your friends in London were expecting total returns, but they were expecting quite a lot of that total return to come from capital growth,
Hmm.
whereas it hasn't done a lot in 10 years now, really.
Hmm.
And certainly the last year or so has been particularly disappointing. But it's hurt by the cost of higher interest rates. There's no two ways about it. So that sort of shakes down quite nicely into the value and the geographical split, really, in the country in terms of what's going well and what's not. Before you even start on some of the upheaval bits we will see this year, like renters' rights and things like that,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah, yeah. And just touching on demographics then, do you have a view of what's going to happen? What's your view of the few? Are we going to see a redistribution, which is one of the theories, isn't it? As the baby boom generation move on, there's going to be an element of redistribution. I mean, give us a couple of thoughts on that.
The great wealth transfer, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a couple of schools of thought, aren't there, which are interesting. I mean, one which really hasn't made a lot of headlines as yet is this idea of bringing the pension back into scope of the estate
Mm.
for inheritance tax. I mean, that's a really significant change, which affects a lot of people. A lot of people who've done reasonably well have got a nice pension, and the SAS has grown massively over the last few years, certainly in the property investment community, in terms of its awareness and what it can hold and all the rest of it. And now that was the cheapest trust anyone was ever going to have, and it's been taken away from them ultimately. And these things don't usually, although they do play about with pensions a little bit, whether that'll be reformed under a new government, who could say? But you can only plan for what there is at the moment, and we know whilst they've climbed down on the farmers and the business property relief and things like that, the smaller estates, and by that I mean sort of sub 5 million, do pay a lumpy amount of IHT. They often haven't been able to afford the very best IHT planning. They
Mhm.
don't want to use a trust for a variety of reasons. Trusts aren't the cheap vehicle they used to be because there's the 10-year charge, the 6% charge now, and things like that to consider as well, apart from losing control of assets and worrying about asset deprivation and all those other things as well. So that's a seismic change, really, that pension change. And I think over time, look, equity release has still got a tail end of a bad reputation from pre 2008, high rates, home reversion schemes that were particularly predatory, really, to be honest. But equity release these days doesn't look like that. It looks like a much more workable solution for an estate. So if baby boomers have got IHT issues, which they're inevitably getting towards, they can release equity from their home and stay put. Now,
Mhm.
that gives them even more incentive to stay put. And, the numbers over 10 million spare bedrooms in the UK every night, because people don't want to move. And some people say, well, stamp duty holiday would lubricate that. Stamp duty free for downsizers, things like that. But as you say, they've got to be able to sell to people at a price they can live with. And do you know what, Paul? People don't want to move. And the older you get, the less you like change as a general rule, right?
Mhm.
And they don't want to move. So they have got those spare bedrooms and they have got the house paid off with their big 40 or 50x gain if they've owned it for 50 plus years or whatever. And they're not worried about who they sell it to. They're staying put. Thank you very much. That's what it is.
Mhm.
And that they are where they are. So tough luck. But this is all the treacle that I've been talking about a bit recently in some of my work that jams the cogs of the economy because you that sounds to me like less geographical mobility. The job market is struggling at the moment, so less opportunities for people to relocate, more stamp duty to pay, so more cost if you want to relocate. And what does that really translate into? It translates into as a rational person, if I've got a job offer and it's a new job and I'd quite like it, well, it might have been that a 20% pay rise 6, 7 years ago would have been enough for me to go, oh yes, please, I'll jump at the chance. Whereas now I look and go, well, hold on, with the fiscal drag, with the stamp duty, with the this, I need a 40% pay rise. And so opportunities are suppressed, social mobility, geographical talent moving around is less and less likely. Of course, people can commute and things like that. But when you're talking about serious full-time posts for people who are getting paid more money,
Mhm.
none of that to me sounds like it will really help the economy. And it's all this treacle concept of just people staying put, which is all about taking cover and saving and the stuff that we've already talked about as well. So I think values will probably hold up pretty well because the other thing that you'll see people do more is baby boomers access some of this equity and distribute to their children. There's a much bigger incentive to gift it out now if you're
Mhm.
getting a 40% discount. So for a lot of people, it's worth them considering equity release to get it out of their estate. It
Mhm.
depends on where they are in life, how old they are, what size bequest they're leaving behind or whatever. But IHT thresholds going up are not on the agenda for this government, Paul. That much I think we can guarantee.
Definitely, definitely not. And I think if there's any takeaway from that is that more than ever, we all need to be taking good quality advice as early as possible. And it's feeling like almost on an annual basis because the sands feel to me like they often move. There's things that, we were advised to do 10 years ago, which are now completely out of date. And
Yeah.
you wouldn't recommend that to anybody. They need to take a completely fresh look at it. So bringing us to your outlook um, um, for 2026. I mean, you've mentioned a couple of things, and I don't want to steer you in any particular direction, but obviously the renters' rights that you've mentioned that. Um, be fascinated to see what you think about where interest rates are going to go, and the following impact on the mortgage market. Um, EPCs have been a topic this year. I'd be interested in your view in that. But don't where are we going? What are the themes that you're seeing for the year ahead?
Yeah, great roundup. So we'll starting with the macro, start with the big question is always the interest rate. What's it going to do? I think we'll see another clip in the rates down to 3.5 on the base rate. But the bad news is I don't really see that filtering through to the 5-year swaps market and therefore into the mortgage market. So I've kind of steeled myself that 5.25 to 5.5 is the base cost per annum of financing these
Hmm.
days on property. So if it doesn't work at that sort of level,
Hmm.
then there's a very much a keep, kill, or cure three-part strategy in terms of properties in your portfolio, right? And cure probably means you need more yield from somewhere, right?
Hmm.
So, and I'd always look at cure before disposing because disposal is hard. We're fortunate in a way in that we are able to buy very well, so we can replace stock if we need to and still make money.
Hmm.
But it's not easy to buy at 20+% discounts to things. I shouldn't say easy, but it does. We get lots and lots of opportunities to do that on a monthly basis.
I mean, there are obviously a lot of transactional costs,
There are,
more than ever,
yeah.
so swapping asset for asset A for asset B, you even if it's a great transaction, everybody's taking their slice more than ever,
Yeah, 7% roughly we work on the way in these days. So if you think about from that side of things, and when we dispose of something, we're probably realizing 91 to 92% of the value by the
Mhm.
time we've had a void, by the time we've paid an agent, by the time we've got a solicitor. So that shows you how tight those margins are. So that probably tells you why we don't buy much at 20% off, Paul, because if 20% off becomes 13% off, and we're only realizing, there's only a 5% margin in there, so it's not worth getting out of bed for. So yeah, we have to do better deals than that ultimately. But get rid, kill is the most extreme of the strategies, realistically, that you've got in there. Keep might just be a fairly simple tweak upwards on the rent and things like that. But cure might be, reposition. What is that property doing? What could it be doing? Is there something better it could be doing in order for me to keep it? What do I need to fix? What's the problem that I need to fix that's not getting me top rent? Or am I switching it to leasing it to a provider or whatever? So
Yeah.
those are all on the cards. And that's, if I'm right about what's going to happen in the interest rate. And I think I am. I think I am right, unless we have a black swan style event. There's a fair bit of chatter that people think base might go down under 3% and things like that. The reason why I think that's wrong, Paul, is if you look at the 30-year bonds at the moment in the UK, they yield 5.25%,
Mhm.
right? The yield curve goes up very steeply. So the yield curve is just the duration of all the bonds plotted on one graph, right? And it's particularly steep at the moment. And the reason it's steep is because we've got known quantities, like we know the demographics situation and the baby boomers and all the stuff that you talked about. We've got a participation rate problem, fewer taxpayers per retired head of
Mhm.
population. Now, if we can't get the money out of those retired people's pockets because they're not feeling bullish or for whatever reason or they can't move because they're stuck in the treacle themselves, like you said, particularly in certain parts of the country, then what's that going to do to the economy in the medium term? It's not great. We've got health issues that we could do with sorting out, and we've got productivity problems we could do with sorting out, and we've got climate change issues we could do with sorting out. None of that. We're not going to make any major inroads into that this year. I don't think we're not yet at the stage where AI really is fully agentic and can take so many jobs from people. And when we are at that stage, I think it's going to hurt before it helps, apart from anything else.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. I mean, I saw a very interesting article about in the professional services market, and this is anecdotal and whether this is actually transpiring, but professional teams where there was a manager and you would have he or she would have four assistants, and now the model is more like the manager and she will have just one assistant in the team,
yeah.
and they'll be optimizing a lot of AI. Now, obviously that affects job numbers. I also wonder what is that going to do for the opportunities for wage growth? Because obviously we need wage growth if we want to, you know, be an abundant society. But just come back to the interest rates. I saw something this week. So you're thinking maybe 3.5 this year?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see 3.25, but I think 3.5 is a good stab, yeah.
So I think a French bank this week came out and they threw out raising an eyebrow for like 2.5. Um,
Mm,
and as you say, you've got to be careful what you wish for, because if we want 2.5, what's got to happen to get
yeah.
2.5?
Yeah.
And it's probably not good news, is it?
No, significantly accelerated unemployment is the easiest answer to that. Is maybe, but I mean, Morgan Stanley said at the beginning of 2025 that we'd see 2.75, and we ended the year at 3.75. Sometimes I think some of the banks talk their own book a little bit, Paul, to an
Yeah,
extent,
yeah, maybe so.
trying to persuade people to invest in various things. And what they're effectively saying when they say that is, look, guys, the risk-free rate of return has been high. It's going to come down, and that this is a factor in the whole of the property market, apart from anything else. It's certainly a factor in business. If you can get 5.25% on a 30-year gilt, right? What's your problem? Inflation, right? Do we still remain relatively, in inverted commas, committed to controlling inflation? It would seem so. We've had a
Mhm.
huge couple of challenges on that front over the past years. We did put rates up probably higher than most people thought we needed to
Mhm.
control those risks. And the risk management worked. It
Mhm.
could have been done slightly differently, sure, but it worked. And they've come back down. And now inflation is on the way down, although probably for the wrong reasons because the economy cooled so much around the budget, aside from anything else.
Mhm.
But there is now this sort of very proactive stance from the government in terms of intervention in inflation, really, in the bits that they can control. But while the minimum wage is, remember last year, minimum wage went up 6.7. It was only last April. Minimum wage was up 6.7. That's pretty inflationary for your pubs and all the rest of it. Now, we've got another event like that because we've got huge business rates increases for some businesses this year. We've got another 4.2 on the minimum wage. But last year, of course, we had the national insurance rise as well, which was a really significant, the cost of a minimum wage member of staff, as on my calculations, was up 11% last year, Paul.
Mhm.
So that filtered through as much as it could into, I call it the joy tax. Really, it costs so much to have a pint these days, or whatever. Which is another reason why, in joking aside, there won't be a feel good factor in the economy because
Mhm.
you give up your Monday night, you give up your Tuesday night if you were someone who used to
Mhm.
step out on those evenings.
Mhm.
It's a real shame, and you see that in front of you, and I see that in the books of some of the businesses that I'm involved in as well. There's no two ways about it. So that's probably covered I mean, inflation, I think. I mean, look, the Bank of England are saying we'll be down to 2% in Q2 and kind of like we're okay, low twos, 2.1% at the end of the year. I think it's too hopeful. I'm not going to lie. I still think there's some core bits in there. But happily now we're arguing over 0.5%, 0.75%. It's not a huge deal. Um,
I think inflation is an interesting topic because you've got what you're talking about there is CPI effectively.
yeah, yeah,
But interestingly, you also mentioned, and this is my experience, that there is households are having to tighten their belts because of the realities of what they're spending their money on. Everybody has got their own personal ecosystem that has its own inflation rate. And again, no violins are going to come out now. But you look at the cost of a skiing holiday, I would say it's gone up at least 100% in the
yeah,
last 5 years.
yeah.
And if you're looking at some of these high altitude resorts and you look at what the weekly cost is now, it is absolutely astonishing. You think, wow, there is only a small part of the population that is going to go to these really high altitude resorts. Is fascinating. So it's how do you square that in your mind? Between we're seeing like CPI fall, but yet in the context of our daily lives, if you and I hope we will in due course, go out for a steak and we have a nice bottle of wine and we both order a steak, that's 100% up in the last 5 years,
Yeah,
no doubt about
yeah,
it.
yeah, I'd agree. And I think probably the cost base of those businesses is up 100% in
Yeah.
the past 5 years as well. And that's reflective of that. So remember inflation, when it was raging, Paul, don't forget food inflation was 20%.
Hmm.
Now we're in a more fortunate position where you could see it, you could feel it. You used to fill the trolley in Aldi quite easily for change out of 100 quid. Now it's probably 150 quid. That's the difference there. So obviously that sounds more like 50% over 5 or 6 years, which it probably is, to be honest. But that hits certain ecosystems a lot harder than others. The skiing holiday is the one that you notice. And certainly all holidays, I have noticed a huge, huge increase. But I mean, aviation inflation has been huge. They caught up after the pandemic. It was also a chance to sort of disturb prices. So people
Hmm.
started overpaying for flights and holidays because they were so keen. And companies are intelligent, they look at that and go, well, if people will pay more, then maybe we'll just keep it there for next year. And you saw some huge, particularly in 2024, actually, there was some huge aviation inflation back in September 2024, about 30% year on year it was. So they're making up for lost time for the pandemic, plus getting away with what they can, but there's still their margins are squeezed because all of their costs, and this is back to the real household disposable income point. How can we increase GDP per head and
Hmm.
be worse off at household level? Well,
Hmm.
because the government's taking more out the pie. So
Hmm.
what we don't see is the bits that the government is lifting. And the smorgasbord budget, they tried to get away with that sort of framing of it, didn't they?
Hmm.
And that's really, I mean, a smorgasbord is a nice thing, isn't it? Really, with lots of tasty morsels and things like that. But everybody got hit somewhere, and some people got hit on multiple levels. And
Yeah.
if you tax, I mean, look, there's nothing better for controlling inflation than taxing the hell out of people. Not that I would recommend it, right? But the flip side of that is it's at the cost of economic growth, as you've said. And if
Yeah.
you are banging a drum or were that said growth, 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 it's
Hmm.
not really congruent with that activity. But that is what happened in 2025.
And on this subject of growth, I mean, let's just be honest, we haven't seen it, have we? There was this mantra at one point of growth, 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 but we just haven't seen it. So, what's your outlook 2026 for economic growth? And then where do you see the real estate market? And I'm happy for you to slice and dice that as I wish, because it's kind of a bit, it's a bit of a misleading question. Say, where's the real estate market going? Because it's thousands of markets. So, what's your take on those two aspects?
Absolutely. So economic growth, I think, will be in the low 1% again, between 1 and 1.5, 1.2, 1.3, something like that, for all the reasons that we've already talked about. I won't bore everyone by sort of rehashing any
Hmm.
of that, but it's hard with the regulatory breaks, even though we were told that regulations will be cut. Very limited regulations have been cut, and lots of new regulations have been introduced.
Hmm.
Renters' rights would be a good example of those, I dare say you could throw a blanket over half the stuff in renters' rights and say, well, that's kind of already covered by existing legislation, but it's just not being enforced,
Hmm.
right? But nonetheless, big shiny. And look, people like big political statements and big change. And remember, Angela Rayner said no Section 21 on day one, right? Which we
Hmm.
all knew couldn't happen legally apart from anything else. But there we go. In terms of where the market is going to go on the back of that, well, like I said, we haven't got the headwinds of the stamp duty change. We have got the headwind of the fiscal drag that's going to stay with us.
Hmm.
What will happen with this self-employed change to lending rules and things like that? Because there are lots of, millions of self-employed people in the country, and their geographical mobility makes a difference. And there's lots of them who always bemoaning the fact they can't borrow. It's much more difficult. And there are some relatively easy things that could be done. There's still lots of self-employed people I speak to who don't realise they could get a mortgage without getting absolutely destroyed by dividend tax and all
Hmm.
the rest of it if they've got money inside a business.
Hmm.
There are more lenders who will look at it's still a niche thing, but that could grow and improve. Depends what sort of lean the government puts on the regulators. But even if that's 5%, 10% of buyers, it has that shift upwards in the market. So what is the one thing that might hold it back? Even more supply. This big
Hmm.
Boxing Day thing, the golden quarter, as I'm calling it, these few months before the act comes into play, is a time when people are going to be thinking, right, do I need to get rid? And the one thing that certainly smaller investors usually don't do is think about what everybody else is doing at the same time. So they think, right, it's time for me to sell. And so there could still be a real significant slice of stock on the market, which will still control prices. It will
Hmm.
still control prices. But in that bracket we talked about earlier, maybe a little bit expanded, maybe from 100 to 500 grand. A lot of that stuff might be bought by first time buyers and second steppers
Mhm.
in areas of the country who still do want to move or get an opportunity to move, as we were saying earlier, if there's a good opportunity. So I think you'll see a 3% plus in the hotter markets that we've talked about of your Manchesters and your Leeds and surrounding areas, especially in the suburban side of things. And
Mhm.
I think you'll see a big fat bagel down in London and not much difference from the southeast. So probably not backwards, but just very, very limp still, Paul,
Okay.
apart from anything else, which will probably average out about 1.5 to 2% for the year.
Yeah, interesting. And where would you put the Midlands in that? So if we said, effectively zero for London, if we said Manchester and Leeds at five, where would you put Birmingham in that equation?
Yeah, and certainly nearer to the Manchester and Leeds than the London side because it's still per cat it's still very very cheap really around a lot of the West Midlands and the East Midlands and certainly the Northwest of late has been pushing to higher average levels than there. So if we just do it on price and value, you'd expect it to perform, alongside your Manchesters of the world, I think.
And how do you see rents this year?
So this is an interesting one. There's obviously how much supply are we going to lose before May or around May? Because again, if we split people into two halves, the people who know about the Renters' Rights Act and the people who don't,
Hmm.
and the people who are being proactive about that now, how many Section 21s are going to be served before the 1st of May? Well, it's
Hmm.
anybody's guess, and it's very difficult to measure. But I would wager hundreds of thousands more are going to be served here at this point in time. Now, will people sell automatically? Will they try the market in a London and say, well, I'm not very happy about this. Actually, I might as well re-let it. Will they go to a guaranteed rent style provider and say, well, let's have a go at that? Um, it's about affordability and area again to an extent. I mean, inner London is squeezed as far as it can be, I think, with affordability, and that has the impact of then overcrowding properties. But that's been going on for years and years. So affordability ceilings will always kick in. But in your markets in the Midlands and the North, there's normally, and I don't mean sort of prime Manchester would have the same problem, really.
Hmm.
Rents would be, and one of the other problems will be some of those newer graduate shiny jobs that might come out and might want a nice pad somewhere are fewer in number at the moment, and I expect will be fewer in number again in 2026. But your suburban markets, your good, honest suburban markets, I think you'll see a healthy enough rent increase. But similar to the capital growth side of things, it'll be held down by London and the Southeast figures for slightly different reasons this time round. And it'll still be boosted up in areas where there is affordability headroom. So
Hmm.
probably I'm going to be in the 3 to 4% bracket as a rule, rent wise. There are numbers out there that are more bullish. But let's see how the supply side of things go. Supply in 2025 was better than 2024. So we'd have to row back quite a lot to get back to that market of 2024.
Hmm. Very interesting. And I want to. Nobody will forgive me if I don't ask you about, where you see opportunities. So I do want to get to that in the last few minutes of the pod. But before we get there, we have got this looming threat of the EPC regime changing. What's your view on that? In my world, I see people in exactly split fairly equally between two camps, which is there are people who are systematically got a schedule of works for their entire portfolios and they're on with that. And then there's an equal number of people who are just saying, do you know what? I'm just going to see what happens. Have you got a view on that?
Yeah, really interesting you say that because I ran a poll on my LinkedIn over the last week, and it was almost a 50-50 split between proactively doing what you say and waiting and seeing. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
So, a few things we should probably say. Eco 4 being repealed in the last budget. We had a lot of works done under Eco 4 on our portfolio, a really significant amount of works. So lots of people haven't even necessarily been aware it's viable. It's not been available necessarily in London and the southeast. They've got to spend the money. If anybody in Westminster doesn't realise, there's a huge difference between putting a 15 grand cap on a spend for a rental property in an ex-colliery town in the northeast and an 800 grand suburban thing down in the southeast somewhere, then they're crazy. So the home energy model and the warmer home scheme, look, there's big money behind that, Paul. More than 10 billion pounds being put behind the warmer home scheme. I am a little bit concerned about this home energy model switchover, which we're led to believe is happening from the old EPC in 2026. They've said late 26 it's going to happen. And of course, with a scoring change, if you've got if you scrape to C, you might want to get your EPC redone before they switch the model and get another 10 years out of it, apart from anything else. Because some of the analysis I've read is saying 15 to 20% of Cs could be relegated back to Ds and even Es again under the
Mhm.
new model, which is just a disaster. I mean, what terrible timing in terms of the joined up thinking picture that is. But
Mhm.
there are going to be significant schemes for landlords, for tenants, because ultimately it is economically difficult. The landlord putting the money in is only going to recover it from a higher rent, which tenants are not normally paying for superior energy performance. It's not on the radar. There will be some who are savvy with that stuff, but not a
Mhm.
majority, I wouldn't
Mhm.
say, Paul, from my experience. And ultimately, if you're asking the asset owner to put money into something where they're not going to get a return, what is their result going to be? Yeah, margins are squeezed
Mhm.
after recent years because of higher cost of debt, aside from anything else, and higher cost of delivery thanks to compliance and operational expenditure. So
Mhm.
you could see more. But again, I think we could also slice the people into people who are on top of the EPC, HEM stuff, and people who haven't really got a clue at the
Mhm.
moment.
Mhm.
We haven't still got firm. I mean, it was mentioned in the budget 2028, 2030 for 2028 for new, 2030 for existing. 2028 feels awfully close to me, Paul.
Feels
And last
just
time
round the
a
corner.
date was put on, it was then pushed to the 31st of December of
Mhm.
that year, which basically means the year after. But this government have not really. I mean, they've ridden a funny line between climate change and policy, really, in terms of relatively neutering some of the stuff that Miliband really wanted to do. So whether this will be another bit of carnage, I mean, there could be a reshuffle
Mhm.
this year, and that could be a complete change before that all happens. If Starmer is hanging on, a
Mhm.
reshuffle is a last roll of the dice sort of thing, really. So let's see what happens.
Let's see what Polymarket tells us in due course. It seems to be the fountain of all knowledge. But I mean, there's a really crucial point in there, um, which clearly you've thought about, and I've thought, and we've thought about at this end as well, which is, if you are able to get an EPC done in 2026, you get a C, you've got 10 years of certainty,
Yeah,
subject to some sort of absolutely outlandish, behavior by any forthcoming government, but. You can create some degree of certainty. So I suppose it's where do you want to place your bets? Is it worth the investment to get the certainty, or are you happy to kind of stand at the roulette table a little bit longer and see how it pans out? There's no right or wrong in that, but I just wanted to signal that because you said it, and I think it's a great point. You can bank that C for a decade, and a decade's a long time in business. A lot would have changed, and I suspect that'll be not the headline in 10 years' time. There'll be a different headline. Now, we're almost out of time. In fact, we're slightly over time, Adam. I apologize for that. Uh, but no one's going to forgive me if I don't ask you the opportunity question. So, people stand back and looking at 2026. Where do you see opportunities in the real estate market this year?
well, I think if we draw together some of the things we've already talked about, really, if there's a large glut of supply, there's going to be a segment of that supply that is really quite motivated and can't move and isn't moving and maybe makes bad decisions about where they place the property, what agent they use, all the rest of that sort of stuff. One of the big mistakes people make, if anybody's listening to this and thinking of getting rid of any stock, Paul, don't be unrealistic on your pricing on the way in. It's the worst thing you can do because if you miss that early window
Mhm.
when you hit the market to get a sale agreed, you want to get a sale agreed in the first month. If you don't, you're gonna struggle. All the stats show that. So use someone realistically. Don't over instruct. But the opportunities on the flip side are going to be when you're going to see transactions fall through, when people learn things. You're going to see things get downvalued, I think, to an extent, because we saw quite a lot of downvals at the back end of last year, not in our own portfolio, but
Hmm.
anecdotally from people that we're working with. Lots of downvals going on, which is I kind of frame that as 2022, 2023 sort of catching up, really, to an extent, because the surveyors have probably done quite a good job of keeping a lid on things. But
Hmm.
if you read the RICS residential market report every month, like I do, they're a pretty miserable bunch at the moment, Paul, really. I know they're always fairly level headed and fairly dour and all the rest of it. But while you've got lots of people looking to get rid of stuff, you've got the pick of stock to buy on the way in. And you can completely circumvent renters' rights if you want to, because you can look at repurposing and potentially leasing to housing providers and things like that. I think there's going to be a huge growth in demand in stock for temporary accommodation
Hmm.
and for housing provider stock as well. It's going to be a huge increase in demand because who's going to house? Look, it seems natural to me,
Hmm.
but Lee, it will become much more difficult to get a tenancy, right? Not necessarily straight away, but at some point. There'll be people who are already putting significant thought into their referencing process and completely redoing it, right? There'll be people who then realise that as time goes on, as renters' rights kicks in and all the rest of it, agents will be advocating for stronger processes, I'm sure. So, where does that push the burden of people who are in the PRS, but arguably maybe should be in the social sector or whatever? It pushes it to the local authority. What can the local authority do? Well, they can't house them themselves. They go to a housing provider who has to lease from the private sector. So I see huge growth in that area over the next 12 months. And if you're not au fait with that area and you're listening to this pod, I highly recommend you get au fait with it because
Hmm.
working with the right sort of providers can be quite hands off and quite lucrative, and you won't be exposed to RRA, which is going to look very attractive, I think, realistically, with a longer term lease.
So just on that note, then, where could we signpost people to take the next step in that?
So the hard work way to do it yourself and to learn all of that for yourself and everything else is to speak to the local authority and or submit freedom of information requests of who they're working with on a housing provider front if you can't find anyone in the council who can answer that question. And look, be prepared to make 25 phone calls or more. You know, it's definitely significant legwork and speak to people who are already leasing property to providers. And there are a few organisations out there that I don't really want to recommend or not recommend anyone, Paul, to be fair to everybody.
Yep.
But there are people who are doing this professionally now. They're set up as housing provider, sourcing agents slash introductory brokers.
Hmm.
So get out there networking, have a look on Google, use your AI tools to see what people are doing, what these arrangements look like. What I would say is, ever since the beginning of last year, these conversations used to be based around the LHA rate, right? With LHA frozen, and it's frozen again in 2026, the providers that we deal with are not even referring to the LHA rate anymore because they know that it's gone. The
Hmm.
LHA rate is covering 2 to 2.5% of new tenancies in the UK. It's a mess. It's a complete mess, and it's an ideological block that Labour have put in there, and that's their decision ultimately. But what it's doing is it's costing much more money on new tenancies because it's backing up and people are negotiating around the market rent. So there's probably never been a better time to get into looking into that sector. Do be careful. Make sure you're working with providers who have got good feedback, who have got a strong balance sheet, who you can speak to a few of their previous landlords. That's one thing I always ask to do. Can I speak to some of your previous landlords to see you've been doing what you said you were going to do?
Hmm. I suppose my inner lawyer needs to say something along the lines of and think about the compliance aspect of things as well. Yeah, what does your mortgage what does your mortgage deed tell you? What does your
Yeah,
what does your insurance cover? What does it not insure? Just square
absolutely.
off that piece. Just be so careful about those things. It's easy to get overlooked, but when things go wrong, they go wrong. And so I think that's fantastic, Adam. Adam, any final comments before I draw us to a conclusion?
What I would say is this is a year, Paul, where you're going to need to do what I normally do by default, really, which is go against the crowd. Don't let all that negativity get into your ears. Yes, hunker down. Be very picky about what you do, but don't be in the inertia. Don't be part of the treacle. There's going to be tons of opportunities. And if you're worried about capital values maybe not doing that much or whatever, start to explore some options of solving other people's problems. Because I can tell you, there's never been so many problems out there in the private rental sector at the
Mhm.
moment, right? You can get paid for solving them, whether that's management agreements, option agreements, exchanges with delayed completions. There's tons of stuff that you could do and still get paid fairly handsomely for what's going to happen in 2026.
I love it. And I definitely endorse that. This is not a year to be sat still. This is a year to build. And I don't mean, you know, bricks in the ground kind of thing, but build your business, build your own ecosystem, build resilience. That's definitely and I think one of the things that can assist us with that is to subscribe to your Sunday supplement. So I was saying before we got on the pod, I saw something you published. I pinged you a message and said, Adam, can you share me the link for that? And you said, I'm not ready yet, but have a look at the AI version. And you sent me the AI version. And thank you, Adam. I have now become completely obsessed by your AI YouTube channel. At every given opportunity, I seem to be putting it on. So, but more seriously, I'm going to send people to LinkedIn because you've got a strong LinkedIn profile. I think you're one of the most highly rated UK real estate commentators on LinkedIn. I think they've acknowledged you for that, or certainly, I think the market has. But once we found you on LinkedIn, tell us a little bit about the supplement and the YouTube offering and where people can kind of explore.
Sure thing. So there's a newsletter that's published once a week on my LinkedIn, the Sunday Supplement. I've been now doing that for a little bit over 6 years, unbelievably,
Congratulations.
but it's grown it's very different from what it looked like 6 years ago. But it has, real-time market commentary every week. It has some of the macro stuff that is relevant, and then it goes into a deep dive in one particular topic. But since I'm now armed, thanks to AI, with a full research team, I'm also doing a significant amount. So I do a daily newsletter, which is generated by AI, which is also on LinkedIn, which you can find under my profile, and an accompanying YouTube channel. So Proponomics has its YouTube channel. It's been going for a few years now. A couple of thousand subscribers, always very keen to try and get that up if possible,
Mhm.
and get bigger and better with all of that. But the AI channel, as you said, also exists. Something in your ears around that. There's a video a day that goes on the AI channel that's presentation format. It is well researched. It's curated by me, and it goes on with subtitles if you're listening to it and you can't get the audio in your ears. It's got an annoying American voiceover at the moment because that's the AI way. But hopefully we'll get a nice British accent in there at some point this year, Paul. Or maybe even one that sounds like me. Or we might be better off with one that doesn't sound like me. I don't
No,
know. I
let's get
don't
one
know.
that sounds like you. But I don't mind the American accent. I think it's good because you're there for the
Yeah.
content, aren't you?
Yeah, you
Um,
are. You are.
Look, that's fantastic, Adam. I'll put a link to LinkedIn. People can have a good look around and explore. Just on a personal level, just all the best to you this year. It's been
And
fantastic
to
to
you.
be following your work and just wishing you continued success this year. And maybe we'll check in at the beginning of next and see how we've got on.
I look forward to it, Paul. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me again. It's my pleasure.
Oh, thank you very much for doing it. Now, as Adam says, likes, comments, subscriptions, they're all part of the ecosystem. So if you wouldn't mind subscribing to the podcast, that would be fantastic. And share it with a friend and draw people to Adam's work. That'd be fantastic. Thank you very much for listening. Plenty more podcasts to come for the rest of the year, but just all the best for this year. Let's hope it's a fantastic one. I've got a feeling that it will be. Thank you very much for listening. Take care.